There's already a very liberal Western European Islam existing in Europe. That's not in Western Europe, but is it Eastern Europe? These are Muslim majority societies who are liberal democracies and who don't have any of the extremism or that kind of problem we have.
Can I assume that the hidden agenda, or maybe the overt agenda behind your writing, is to create the paradigmatic framework for this kind of Islamic thinking?
Indeed, both within the West and both in the Muslim majority world.
I'm Daniel Schwanke, the director of Notre Dame's Academic Center in Jerusalem, and you're listening to Jerusalem Talks. In this episode, Avraham Burg speaks with Mustafa Akyol, a senior fellow at the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C., where he focuses on the intersection of public policy, Islam, and modernity. The pair speaks about Akyol's upbringing in Istanbul, his career as a journalist and author, and the place of both Jesus and Moses within the Quran and Muslim thought. Throughout, Akyol explores the lengthy history between Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, highlighting the many ways that these religions and cultures have impacted each other, both positively and negatively. Akyol also addresses the modern history of Islam and its various moves towards and from liberalism, emphasizing the similarities between this theological journey and those taken by both Christianity and Judaism.
Peace on you, Mr. Akyol.
Peace on you, Mr. Burg. Thanks for having me.
Merhaba, Mustafa.
Merhaba. As I said, your Turkish is impressive.
That's the entire vocabulary. You are a lot of things. You're a journalist, a word journalist. You are a philosopher or intellectual. You write a lot, both short essays, media-wise and magazine-wise, and books. And mainly, you offer alternatives, right?
I try. Thank you so much for your kind words. I try to offer a kind of religious thought from the Islamic perspective that is tolerant, liberal, at peace with other traditions, other worldviews, and ethically upright and still true to the fundamentals of the faith.
You're originally from Istanbul?
I'm originally from Turkey. Well, actually, I was born in Ankara, the capital, but most of my life was in Istanbul. We moved to Istanbul when I was a kid, and yeah, my parents are still in Istanbul. That's my hometown.
I mean, people, I think it's a mistake to say that Ankara is Washington and Istanbul is New York, but Ankara is the city of the government, is establishment, quite secular. Istanbul is much more global, hectic, noisy, beautiful.
Yeah, Istanbul is the more beautiful, crowded, and difficult but interesting city. Ankara is more of a bureaucratic town, smaller than Istanbul. Still, it's big, but I mean, there's a little bit DC too, I think, in New York, but I live in DC now. I like DC with all the greeneries, so I don't want to be unfair to DC.
Oh, no, God forbid. I teach there, so God forbid. We have to be nice to them, especially with the current regime in Washington. You already said that, I mean, just the very few words that we already have, that you have a different approach to something that is branded differently in the Western discourse. And this is the whole idea or the whole profile of Islam in the eyes of the West. You already said, when I said you want to reform or you want to change things, very statement. Can you repeat it? Can you go deeper into it, please?
Sure. I mean, I'm a Muslim myself, and I grew up in the Ottoman Islamic tradition and Turkish tradition, and I strongly believe in the fundamentals of my faith, like I'm a believing Muslim. I've studied the Quran for decades in my life, but I also see the need for reinterpreting the religious tradition in the light of the modern age. And there's a whole tradition of people who've been trying to do that since the 19th century.
Especially in Turkey.
Especially in Turkey. I mean, it begins with Tanzimat reforms in the Ottoman Empire, the young Ottomans who kind of tried to synthesize Islamic belief with political liberalism. They brought concepts like constitutionalism to the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century, which included equal citizenship for Jews and Christians.
The alphabet?
The alphabet change came later under Mustafa Kemal. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk was more of a secularist. So he was not interested in synthesizing religion with modernity. He was just willing to bring, a very European modernity. What I'm talking about is a little bit earlier generation, late Ottoman Empire, that was respectful to the religious tradition, but tried to find new interpretations of it, build new interpretations of it.
What is called in the 19th century the New Order?
They were called New Ottomans. There's a Nahda in Arabic world at the time, the Arab awakening, and thinkers like Abduh in Egypt, the beginnings of Islamic modernism, Sayyid Ahmed Khan in the subcontinent. So actually in the 19th century, Albert Hourani has a great book, Arabic Thought in the Liberal Age.
Stop here for a second, okay?
Sure.
You took us back 200 years, but it's not 200 years in the same place, in a sense that then the Ottoman Empire was the organizing political system of the entire region. So Egypt, but few eruptions, the entire Middle East, Syria, Lebanon, what is today known as Israel and Palestine, and even further, Iraq of today, were part of the greater Turkey.
Yeah.
At the same time, not at the same time, but with the turn of the century, something new was entered, and Istanbul, which is Asian and European, maybe the only city in the world which is bicontinental, was introduced with a European Western secularism, rationalism, and the collision never stopped. The collision and the tension is there up until today between the Western, I would say, secular values and the traditional Muslim ones.
That is true. And I believe in the original synthesis that began to appear in the 19th century with Islam and liberalism in the political and economic sense. That's why I still write about ideas of liberty and human rights and dignity or free markets, in Islam. But one thing, though, ideas that came from the West included not so nice ideas.
Nationalism.
And I think nationalism, sometimes people see nationalism and liberalism as the same thing or compatible. Well, in a nation state, you can definitely have the liberalism, but militant nationalism, like xenophobic, expensive, genocidal sometimes nationalism, has also swept the region. And actually, I believe it destroyed the 19th century spirit of liberalism, tolerance, and pluralism. I mean, there's a period of Ottomanism in the late Ottoman Empire where the Sultan says, Jews are in the synagogue, Christians are in the church, and Muslims are in the mosque. There's no difference between them other than that. So like equal citizenship, embracing all the colors and religions of the empire. That was replaced by nationalism in the early 20th century, which I think, has swept the whole region, created terrible ethnic cleansings, genocide, killings, massacres, oppression, persecution in the Balkans first.
Because the old Turkish Muslim order was forced to contain so many nuances, because there were so many segments and definitions and identities and faith and rituals all over the empire. And the minute the national definition walked in, either you belong or you do not belong.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the thing is, the Ottoman Empire was not a Turkish state. It was a multi-ethnic, multi-religious state. And, as stretching from Vienna to Yemen, at some point in its largest borders. I mean, it included these dozens of different religious and ethnic groups. Jews were one of them, Arabs, Albanians, Bosnians, Serbs, Bulgarians, many Turks themselves. And when it started to disintegrate, certain groups said, this is our land, this is our country now. Now this is Greece. Now this is Bulgaria. And this is Serbia. And there's a slogan famous in the 19th century. They said, Greece is for the Greeks, Serbia is for the Serbs, Bulgaria is for the Bulgarians. Now, that sounds nice until you realize you're not Bulgarian, but you're in Bulgaria. And if you're in Greece, but not Greek, which happened to be Jews, included Jews, by the way. Jews suffered at the hands of Balkan nationalism.
Without going into nationalism in this conversation, but this tribal democracies or tribal regimes echoes up until today. I mean, it's the white supremacy in North America, it's the Jewish state in Israel, it's Germany to the Germans, Hungary to the Hungarians, up until today.
Exactly.
It's not yet resolved, but let's go different places. Before we dive into the pool of your writing, and it's an ocean, it's not just a pool.
Thank you.
For whom it was the most difficult to accept your break away from the ranks, your family, yourself? Because this kind of, I'll put it like this, Turkey and the Turkish people It's a fascinating group of people, and it's a fascinating culture, and very even fun to be with. But there is a certain moment or a certain line you should not cross. Did you cross this line with your writing?
Well, I mean, for almost 25, maybe 30 years almost now, I mean, 30, 25, I have a career of writing in the Turkish language and also in the English language. I was a columnist in a Turkish language newspaper and an English language newspaper. Then I started to write for international outlets, New York Times, and just, brought me all the way to US right now. Within Turkey, I touched upon some hot button issues, and I got really heated reactions by certain camps. For example, I have a book in early 2000s about Turkey's Kurdish question, and it's titled Rethinking the Kurdish Question. And as a Turk, I criticize many aspects of state policies towards the Kurds, banning their language, forcing assimilation, not allowing them to, retain their culture and all that. At the same time, I criticize the PKK, the militant Kurdish armed group. And some Turkish nationals didn't like that. I was thrown a noose in one public conference in Istanbul, like noose to hang people. A far-right, party said, we will hang you people when we come to power. And luckily they never did. Or the fact that I criticized the government and its policies led to, me losing jobs, getting calls from the top that this guy shouldn't, write in this paper anymore, that kind of thing. So in Turkey, I got this kind of intolerant attitude from certain groups. In the broader Muslim world, I mean, I've been writing about issues on Islam a lot in the past 15 years. I mean, I wrote more about Turkey topics maybe 15 years ago, until 10, 15 years ago. Then I switched to broader issues of Islam. And I see Turkey as a part of that. I see the whole Islamic world as one big ummah and try and think about that. I mean, I got into trouble sometimes for my reformist views in Islam.
In Malaysia?
Yeah, in Malaysia in 2017, I was invited to give a few lectures based on the Malay edition of my book, Islam Without Extremes, A Muslim Case for Liberty. And after the second conference, it was on the issue of apostasy in Islam, which is, giving up your religion. And it is considered as a crime in some Muslim
countries. To teach religion, yeah.
Yeah, and I said, this should not be a crime. It's a matter of conscience, and, we should respect freedom of conscience, and we cannot police religion. And then the religious police came and arrested me right after that, and they detained me and took me to...
I had a feeling reading some of your, I call them reformist ideas because I don't have a better definition, that in a way both camps were challenged by you, the traditionalist for sure, and the secular to say, hey, you don't come all the way towards us. It's a kind of an in-between, but let's go further, okay? The envelope of this podcast has a Christian dimension because it's the Holy Land, it's a Notre Dame University, etc. And for years, I'm fascinated by Turkey and Christianity. In what sense? When you talk to an average intellectual or self-appointed intellectual in the West, so the Roman Empire with the Christianity as its religion ended by the end of the 5th century. But you, the Turks, you know that it lasted 1,000 years more, till 1453, I mean, the fall of Constantinople, now Istanbul. So you had 1,000 years of Christian prominent presence in Turkey till it ended. What of these 1,000 years of the Byzantine Empire are still felt in the Turkish spirituality or Turkish identity card of today?
Sadly, not too much. I mean, of course, when you drive around Istanbul today, you will see the great Hagia Sophia, which is, of course...
What is it today? Church, mosque?
It's a mosque today. So it was reverted back to a mosque in 2020. I criticized that, by the way, in an article in New York Times.
And they charge an entry.
They charge an entry to tourists, but if you're going there as a Muslim to pray, I think you can pray. I mean, you can still see the Christian past, but it was, I think, when it was a museum, I mean, it was a place of worship for no one, so that was also lost. But also you had both traditions right in front of your face. You could see all the Islamic calligraphy and the heritage, and you see the Christian iconography. Now, the Christian images are a little bit covered with curtains because of the prayer. One thing I see as a triangle, the Abrahamic triangle I speak about, I actually find Islam and Judaism closer in this triangle to each other theologically, and because of their emphasis on law, the halakha and the sharia. Christianity is a little bit different than us in certain ways in terms of imagery, the idea of a Trinitarian God, but also Islam is similar to Christianity in its universalism. Anyway, so regarding the Byzantines, you can see that, but Turkey in the 20th century, very interestingly, lost the pluralism of the Ottoman Empire. Like, I'll give you one number. About 100 years ago, or let's say in the early 20th century, 120 years ago or something, 1/3 of Istanbul's population was non-Muslim. 1/3. There are like population count censuses showing that. That included a big portion of Greeks, Armenians, and Jews. So the three major, non-Muslim components of the empire, which meant that when you went to Istanbul, there were these very active churches and synagogues and they're Catholic Armenians, and they're, of course, the traditional Orthodox Armenians. And all those institutions and their lifestyle and their neighborhoods was all there. Now, Istanbul is 99%, 9.9 Muslim. Like there are 5,000 Greeks remaining, a bit more Armenians, but still very little, and some 20,000 Jews all across Turkey, I think, in Istanbul. Yeah, maybe it's a little less than that, around a maximum. What happened is people say, you see, Islam destroyed all these minorities. I said, like, well, Islam was there for centuries. This is nationalism. This is a different thing. Turkey's tensions with Greece as a country over Cyprus, over other border issues, led to distrust of Turkish citizens who happen to be Greek, by language and religion. And there has been systematic discrimination against them. There was a pogrom in 1955, terrible event, and many of them fled Turkey and went to Greece. In the meantime, a lot of Turks in Greece came to Turkey. There was actually even a population exchange back in 1923. So Istanbul became more homogenous as old Turkey itself, as Turkish, which reads Muslim, and we lost the non-Muslim, that is Jewish and Greek and Armenian and Jewish, big populations of the empire, which made it more diverse, more lively, interesting, and colorful, and it became a more homogenous country. And I think that was a loss of pluralism and loss of richness, as it happened back in the Balkans with the loss of Turks, in some cases Jews as well, like in Salonika, in Greece.
But it's interesting, at the time that Istanbul is losing its others and becoming quite monolithic in its population, though the diversity of the city between the various kind of Turks, religious, non-religious, modern, feminists, traditionalists, is all over the place. At the time, you find it important to write about those who are absent from the landscape. You wrote 2 books. The first is Jesus in Islam, and the second is Moses. I mean, I would have said, 16th century, I understand why you write it. 17th century, I understand. 21st century, when it's all empty. So let's begin with your motivation for this, and then let's explore the argument, because in each book with Jesus, you have a different analysis of the importance of Jesus to the soul of Islam than the importance of Moses. Let's begin with your motivation. Why do you write something like that?
Great question. I mean, the books are the Islamic Jesus and the Islamic Moses, literally. And the Islamic Jesus was 2017, Islamic Moses last year, actually more recent. They were both printed in the United States. So I didn't write them for mainly the Turkish audience. I wrote them for a more international audience, including American readers and who are interested in religious issues. I think there's a great interest in religion in America, intellectual interest, and I appreciate that. I mean, I wrote the Islamic Jesus at a time when, Islam was on the news as the scary religion, ISIS, Al-Qaeda. Of course, those extremists are there. But I wanted to say, look, I mean, Islam is not that alien to you as a religion. I mean, if you're speaking of a Judeo-Christian tradition, but there's a Judeo-Christo-Islamic tradition, in my view. This is a big one, Abrahamic 3. And many Christians might not be aware of the fact that Jesus is highly appreciated in the Quran.
This is an apology from your point of view?
Not an apology. This is just showing some very interesting fact about Islam to an audience that might not be aware of it. Also, though, I just wanted to say, hey, we have Jesus and Islam. I mean, Islam appreciates the Quran, respects Jesus highly, calls him the Messiah, has a chapter on Mary, the mother The Quran confirms virgin birth. At the same time, because it's closer to Judaism, Islam theologically, it rejects Trinity.
Let us be a bit more accurate.
Sure.
It recognizes Jesus as a prophet, as a Messiah, but not as the Son of God. It is about the Trinity, because maybe Trinity goes to the concept of monotheism, that in Islam you say, like in Judaism, illallah wa Allah, I mean, there is no God but God, and the Trinity is a challenge to the oneness of God. So they accept Jesus as a fantastic, inspiring human being, but accepting the Christian dimension of the Christian theology as the Son of God.
Yes, exactly. I mean, maybe a Christian should explain us better what Trinity exactly means. I think it's not out of monotheism, but it's a complicated view from the Jewish and Islamic perceptions of monotheism.
But God is one and that's it.
God is one, period. We don't think that there's more to that about that. I mean, the mainstream Christian theology brings more nuance, complication to that, which is not, our thing. One more thing, though, but in the book, I showed that, wait a minute, by the way, Islam takes this very interesting view, calls Jesus Messiah, not just a prophet, but Messiah, Messi, and also confirms the virgin birth, tells about his miracles. Like Islamic teachings about Jesus actually resonate very strongly with some early Christian sects.
Well, hang on. Slow down.
Oh, slow, sure.
Early Christianity, it was a family. I mean, you could have a family that one member of the family was old rabbinical Jew, and a brother or a cousin or an uncle or a sister could have been the new Jew, which followed the Rabbi Jesus. You, Mustafa, you take it a step further and you say, listen, deep there inside, there is a polemic or there is a cleavage between Paulus and Jacob.
Yes, you checked the book. Okay, good. So what?
Habibi, I come ready. I read it.
I appreciate that. Yeah.
So go deep there, because I have a feeling that if we understand your distinction between Paulus and Jacob, the brother of Jesus Christ, it will be much easier to understand the relationship of the way you understand Islam and Christianity. So explore it a little bit for us.
Okay, sure. Well, in early Christianity, in the first few centuries, there are many views, many sects, and Christians don't have a state, so they just, go into different directions, which actually is pluralistic and nice. But
Minor Asia is so important for the spreading.
Exactly. This is happening in my country, like in the southern coasts of Turkey, part of it. Paul comes there and preaches and all that. Now, what is interesting is that the nature of Jesus, that's a complicated idea, right? I mean, God becoming man and incarnation and all that. It goes all the different directions. And there are certain groups that are having a low Christology, as later Christians would say. They don't necessarily think Jesus is fully divine. And now, there are some Gentile versions of that, like Arianism, which is known as a heresy. But even aside from that, even before that, there are so-called Jewish Christians. Now, what does a Jewish Christian mean? These are some Jewish people at the time living in historical Palestine. They think Jesus is the Messiah that Jews were waiting. He's dead, but still the mission goes on, so they accept them as the Messiah, but they're still Jews. So they observe the Sabbath, they eat kosher, they do everything that is required by the halakha. And they see the brother of Jesus, Jacob, as you said, who's called James in English. And there's a letter of James from him in the New Testament towards the end, which I find very interesting. They see him as their patron saint. Like he's the leader of the community, the Jerusalem church after Jesus. And he himself is a Jew, a halakhic Jew. This tradition is there. But then Paul comes to the scene. He's a late disciple. He actually becomes a disciple after the death of Jesus. He's actually an enemy of the movement in the beginning. But then he has his road to Damascus, so he converts, and then he starts to preach the message of Jesus to the Gentiles, to the uncircumcised.
Stop here. When Jesus says, I didn't come in order to change anything in the Torah, came Paul and said, yes, I came to change. So it's between changing and not changing, or conservative and reform.
In Paul's understanding, the message of Jesus is so profound that it should not be just a Jewish thing. It should be taken to the whole world, the Gentiles. And he starts to preach this message, which initiates and ultimately creates what we know as Christianity today. It becomes a religion of these non-Jewish people believing in this Jewish Messiah. And from all over the Roman Empire, it just Paul initiates this whole Gentile Christianity, which becomes the Christianity. Now, what happens is the Jews who accepted Jesus are not a part of this because they're halakhic Jews. And other Jews don't look at them as favorably because they believe in something that most Jews don't believe in. It's like a messianic movement that is not appreciated by the majority. So historians say they died out, but there are also later groups in the first century, second century, like Nazarenes, Ebionites. Christian fathers are speaking about them. They said, oh, these are people who say they believe in Christ, but they still don't appreciate his divinity, or I'm just paraphrasing, but they're Jews, actually. They're not real Christians. So there is something remaining out there, and it's called Jewish Christianity, and historians have written about this. And it's generally assumed that they kind of disappeared in a few centuries. You don't hear much about them in the 5th century anymore.
And you argue, in a way, maybe they disappeared officially, but in a way, we can discover them in our Islam. It's the concepts of theirs.
Yeah, I argue that the theology of Jewish Christianity had a rebirth in Mecca in early 7th century Arabia.
In what sense? Elaborate a little.
In the sense that what Islam teaches about Jesus is very similar to this early Jewish Christian perception of Jesus as the Messiah, but still not divine. I mean, Messiah is not a God that you will worship. He's still a servant of God, sent by God for redemption, of course. But
let me summarize it in order to move on, because otherwise you and me can be there for the entire night and it won't be enough. You say that the Jacobin, not the French Jacobin, but the Jacob's Christianity, which is early Judaism, the way they interpreted both Judaism and later on the contribution of Jesus into it, this is what eventually was absorbed into the Muslim comprehension of Islam, not the later on version of Paulus and on.
Yes, the teachings about Islam, about Jesus, quite remarkably match with the beliefs of these early Jewish Christians. Now, this was noticed by other theologians. I mean, there's a German scholarship on this. Other scholars, Patricia Corona had a fascinating article about Jewish Christianity and Islam. Hans Küng mentions that in his book and says it's very interesting, but just moves on to something else. So a lot of people notice this as, wow, very interesting, but I just looked more into it. That's why the subtitle of the book, The Islamic Jesus, it reads, How the King of the Jews Became a Prophet of the Muslims. Right?
King of the Jews, this is how he
King of the Jews, they put on the cross.
On the cross.
And by that, I mean, the Jewish Messiah as believed by these unorthodox, heretical Jews of the first few centuries, because it is the same way Islam sees Jesus. Very respected Messiah, but still a Jew, still halakhic, and still you're not going to supposed to worship him, but he calls you to worship God, which is not a triune God, but the God of the Old Testament and the Quran. And I see a very similar connection there. So that is one plot in the book, and I discuss how this rebirth happened. Of course, some people try to trace Jewish Christianity surviving into 7th century Arabia. There's kind of a historical link between these things. There are some rock inscriptions that sounds like Jewish Christianity found in Negev in a later date, maybe closer to Islam. Wow, is that a connection? And of course, there's a theological answer to this. And a Muslim can say, well, God revealed the same truth to them. It's revealed the same truth to Prophet Muhammad. So that's a matter of faith. But what I'm saying is that there is this very intricate connection between Islam and some early Christian movements. I mean, and I can see how Christians looking at this today can say, oh, understand, one of our heresies influenced Islam. Muslims can say, oh, you see, even Christians knew that this was the true religion, but they went wrong after that. And those polemics are possible, but I just wanted to show this fascinating connection between our religions so people can look at each other with more city and maybe respect too, hopefully.
So after you stopped at the place that many people passed by, you moved on deeper into mythology. And after you explore early Jesus, Judaism, Islamic interconnection, you moved into Moses.
Then, okay, so what happened is...
Okay, talk to us about your Moses, and then I'll talk to you about your Jesus and your Moses, okay?
Sure. What happened is my publisher, St. Martin's Press, was very happy with the Islamic Jesus, and they said, why don't you make a sequel to this book? And I said, well, what can I do? Well, I can write about the most prominent prophet in the whole Quran. Who's that? I said, that is Moses.
Mentioned in the Quran more times than Muhammad himself.
Definitely. His name is mentioned more than 130 times. The most mentioned human being in the whole Quran is Moses. The name Muhammad is mentioned just 4 times. So when you read the Quran, you learn about Moses more than anything else, more than anybody else. He's the most dominant figure. And also, there's another interesting, after Moses, the second figure that is most mentioned, the most second mentioned human being. Do you know who is it? Can you guess?
Ismail?
Not Ismail. Some people guess Abraham. Some people say maybe Noah. These are good guesses. Abraham is probably the third. But the second most mentioned figure is the Pharaoh.
Really?
Yeah, the enemy.
The enemy, the adversary defines us.
So Moses and the Pharaoh. So the Quran heavily features the story of Israelites being persecuted in Egypt and Moses saving them out of that persecution through the Red Sea, departing, very similar to the biblical story with little interesting nuances. So in the Islamic Moses, I looked into that aspect and I said, why Moses is, I tell that story, why Moses is so important for Islam in the beginning. And my explanation to that, as pointed out by some academics, is, well, the story of Moses and the Israelites being persecuted in Egypt and finding a way out through the Exodus, this resonated strongly with the experience of Muslims in Mecca, led by Muhammad, they were persecuted by polytheists, as the Egyptians were. And God told them, as if you believe in Revelation as the Quran, because the Quran told them the stories of Moses to inspire them. Look, you are being persecuted here, but just like the Israelites, at the end, God will save you. And you will have an exodus, which will take you out of this. And that exodus is called Hijrah in Islam. That's a migration.
Migration from
Mecca to Medina. And when they go to Medina, they are now more powerful, but there's the conquest of Canaan or conquest of Hijaz. So after that migration, there are some conflicts with the tribes. And
the history of the prophet and his first disciples is a reflection to the ancient mythological story of Exodus.
Exactly.
And therefore, this way it rose its maybe not legitimacy, but its spiritual power.
Spiritual, and in a sense, a little bit of a military and political, legal power too. Because, what happens after the Exodus, of course, Moses and then Joshua, they conquer the land. They kind of somehow establish a halakhic, polity there. The blasphemers or Sabbath breakers are punished. So there is like kind of a beginning of a political even form. The ancient kingdom of Judea ultimately comes out of that, which is very interesting. Again, Patricia Crona, she said Moses is the paradigmatic prophet for Muhammad. He starts in persecution, takes his people out of persecution and goes there and then wins some conquests, He wages war against some enemies, the Amalekites or Jericho and all that. And that's why in Islam, in the life of Muhammad, you have some battles in the second phase in Medina. Now, what do we make of these battles today is a very important question. Do we think that the battle with the Amalekites in Judaism is still relevant today? Or do we believe Prophet Muhammad's battles with the pagans and even the Jewish tribes there in Medina, which we can talk about,
resolved it all?
There's still commandments today, and I know some extreme people in Israel think it is, and I know extremists in Islam who say that is, and want to bring those commandments into active war situations, active conflicts today. but I'm in favor of a more historical reading of these things. These are one-time events that happened. It's in our religious tradition. How do we understand them? And I was fascinated, for example, to read Moses Mendelssohn, a figure I value a lot, making the argument that this was a one-time event back there. It doesn't mean Jews need theocratic states. It was a one-time theocratic experience.
Maybe later on in one of the next conversations of ours, we can talk about Freud and Edward Said interpretation of Moses. Two different interpretations, but leave it now. Let me try to digest, all of this wisdom. Did I understand Akyol's teaching? Okay. Let's see if I understood it. I begin earlier that the cleavage between Paulus and Jacob is not just an historic factual debate or split. It's the key to understand the relationship between Christianity and Islam, in the sense that Paulus maybe gave birth to the church, but Jacob, in a very deep sense, gave birth or gave the seeds to the birth of Islam. Then I move on and I say, for you, Moses, which was earlier chronologically, is not just a Jewish prophet. This is why he's mentioned so many times in the scriptures of Quran. He is the prophet of entire humanity who teaches each and every one under each and every circumstances how to go out, how to self-redeem from slavery to liberty, and how to make this liberty into a covenant of justice. Then comes Jesus, and he is not law and order like Moses, like Sharia, like commandments, like do this, do that. He is about compassion and mercy, and therefore Moses is the ethos of law, and Jesus is about compassion, and Islam, the way you understand it, is the fusion of them both. A legal normative system with an emotional compassion, desire for justice values.
It is. And, I didn't figure it out that way, but yeah, it is. And Alija Izetbegovic would agree with you. He was this great leader of the Bosnians I admired a lot. He has this book, Islam Between East and West, and he puts Islam between Judaism and Christianity, getting somewhere in the middle of the road between them in the emphasis of the law and Jesus' more spiritual teachings. I think so. And one thing, though, we all can a little bit of something from Jesus, even if you're not Christians. I say this because, and I have a chapter in the last chapter of my book, Islamic Jesus. There's a part which says, what can Muslims learn from Jesus today? Now, both Moses and Muhammad, peace be upon them, both of them, they initiated a whole new religious tradition, a whole new religious law. Moses initiates the halakha, the 10 commandments, and Leviticus and all the biblical commandments. And Prophet Muhammad initiates Islamic law, right? It starts with him, and then, of course, developed by scholars, the ulama and the rabbis. So we both have legal traditions in Islam and Judaism.
And North Africa and Iberian Peninsula during the Middle Ages were actually the exchange ground between these two huge civilizations.
Exactly. That's why, Jews found Islam very interesting and studied Islamic law and theology. Maimonides, Saadia Gaon before him, they got ideas from Muslim theologians like the Mu'tazilites, and the law is very interesting. Maimonides actually uses the term Sharia for Jewish law in his Judeo-Arabic writings. So we both have a legal tradition. Jesus is a very interesting figure. He's not the initiator, creator of the tradition. He comes onto the tradition and as a reformer. And he calls on his fellow Jews to take the commandments of the halakha less literally, understand the ethical purposes behind it. Paul would later totally, take a few more steps further.
Get rid of the norms and just...
But we don't have to go that far. But we can say still the Jesus perspective, like the Sabbath is made for men, not men for the Sabbath. The idea of the law is actually to help human beings and serve their interests and values and so on. Or like there are teachings in the New Testament which we can see as a reformist perspective on religious law. which can be appreciated from a Jewish point of view, which can be appreciated by an Islamic point of view. Again, Moses Mendelssohn makes that point. I was fascinated to read that in his book, Jerusalem. And in Islam, people like Muhammad Abduh, that I mentioned, 19th century reformist, they actually said that we can take an idea from Jesus into looking at the law not in a rigid, literalist, blind obedience way, but understanding the ethical purposes of that. So in this triangle, there are things to learn from each other. And I think the perspective of Jesus, regardless of Christian theology, is valuable.
Mustafa Bey, I want to push back, okay?
Sure.
At least for the sake of the discussion, not, God forbid, out of no respect, because I'm fascinated by what you say. I understand the 19th century Muslim thinking. Wow, the world is open. I mean, the Western empires, after so many, since Saladin may be coming back to the region, and since the 13th century last encounter between the Crusades and the Muslims, finally we talk to each other somehow because the Middle East opens slowly but surely. So I understand the need for respond for maybe not liberal ideas, but the secularization of the human condition. But when you look today at the end of the first quarter of the 21st century, at least in the Muslim world, I do not want to talk here about the Jewish and the Christian one, but in the Muslim world, what took over is a pushback against these ideologies. I mean, the 20s of the last century, the Muslim Brothers concept was born, which is the concept of political Islam. And when you look today, Turkey is, in a way, the regime, forget about the politics of it, but the concept is political Islam, politics in power. In Egypt, it's not political Islam as a party, but as a concept, is a very religious oriented or driven. And I can go on and on and on and on. And at the same time, where you see closer relationship between religion and state in Muslim political entities, you see a deeper cleavage between church and state in the secular West. So the two models are drifting apart from each other, a merger or fusion of church and not church and state, religion and state on the Muslim world, and a separation or deeper separation at the Western secular Christian one. Why is that?
Well, hard to speak about the West that much. I mean, but I can definitely speak about the state of Islam that you described very well.
In Turkey, that was so secular for a while.
Exactly, but I'll try to add a few nuances to that. It is true that the more liberal trends in the second half of the 19th century in the Muslim world, in the Ottoman Empire and the Arab world declined. That's why Hurani speaks of a liberal age as a bygone, era. And they were replaced by more, rigid ideologies, strident, reactionary. Islamism, as you described, politics is one of those, maybe the latest of those. But they also include nationalism, and Arab socialism, which was also, sweeping the region during the time of Abdel Nasser and all that. So,
which were both nationalist and social.
The nationalists and socialists, they combine the worst combination possible. And in Syria, Assad regime and all, there still was a remnant of that until very recently. But this happened in a context which is the Muslim world in the 20th century found itself cornered by, first of all, Western colonialism. The Ottoman Empire was trying to liberalize, and it collapsed tragically, and all Muslims found themselves most of them, colonized by the French and the British and the Italians, and Russia crushed the liberal trends in Central Asia, which people don't know much about. There was a Jadid reform movement in Central Asia. Then the Arab-Israeli conflict added another sense of insecurity, which is still going on. Societies or civilizations don't tend to liberalize when they feel insecure.
This is actually Bernard Lewis' argument.
The Muslim world have been feeling very insecure for 100 years for very understandable reasons. So that the sense of being cornered empowered the more radical figures. It's still going on. And one more thing, you mentioned secular models like Turkey's secularism. I would maybe slightly differ on that. Yeah, I believe in a secular liberal state, but also the secularism examples we had in the Muslim world were also illiberal. They were not tolerant. They were actually sometimes oppressive on religion, which added to the problem. Like Ataturk's Turkey, Shah in Iran, the first Shah, he came and banned the hijab of Muslim women.
Alawis.
Yeah, exactly. The If you ban hijab of Muslim women, what do you think they will do? Well, they started hiding in their homes, and the Ayatollah supporting them said, we will topple this tyranny, which is exactly what happened several decades later on. And then Khomeini said, now they will all wear it, right? So the liberal solution, let them do what they want to do, got lost. So it's a perfect storm of Islamic world having its own religious problems, intolerance, and sometimes on that with liberal trends pushing forward, with all these foreign attacks coming onto the religion, which made the Muslim world cornered. That's why you started to pop up these. You mentioned the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, when did it come? In 1927. What happened in the 1920s? Oh, the Ottoman Empire collapsed in 1924. The Caliphate was abolished. People thought, we're lost. We are just a civilization.
Here an explanation. The Caliphate was the global Islam political system, which included all the political entities which were part of the Muslim world. That was the empire.
Yeah.
And the perceived followers of the ancient Caliphate was the Ottoman Empire. The minute the Ottoman were replaced by the Turks, and it declared we are secular, and therefore we do not continue the ancient caliphate, a vacuum was created. Who do I belong? Said the individual in today Jordan, today's Iraq, today's Egypt. Up until for 1,000 years, I was a citizen of the caliphate, and now, so you say, into this vacuum they walked in.
Yeah, I mean, I think the sense of besiegement, the sense of your tradition being attacked and humiliated by outside powers or hardcore secularists within killed the more liberal trends and empowered the more reactionary ones, which is still going on in various manifestations around the world. But I'll tell people, look, it wasn't easy for Christendom to come to a liberal solution.
It took some bloodshed.
They had an effort with the Renaissance, which is very good, but then you have the Reformation, and comes the after-Reformation, post-Reformation conflict and violence and bloodshed and 30 years of war, like almost 150 years of drama. Then comes some liberal ideas, John Locke, talking about with the kind of thing I'm talking about. That's great, but then you have nationalism, fascism, Nazism. I mean, it only after the Second World War, Europe emerged as a liberal continent, right, of liberal democracies started to form. And when you look into the centuries before that, wow, Europe was a terrible place, and with some exceptions. And Jews know that better than most people. I think they had to escape from this Christendom several times, came to the lands of Islam, came to the Ottoman Empire because it was much safer, much more tolerant.
The Ottoman Empire is the one that opened its gates to Jews when we were expelled in 1492 from the Iberian Peninsula, and later on during the Second World War and the horrors of the Holocaust. That's for sure.
Exactly. There were even some Ashkenazis coming to the Ottoman Empire from Germany in the later periods as well. I tell people, look, I'm a Muslim. I'm proud of my faith. I belong to this civilization. I'm a child of the Islamic civilization. And I accept that it is in a very difficult time. Civilizations have their own difficult times and eras and epochs. Christianity had terrible times. Judaism had many crises and then 5,000 years of history. So this is a difficult time, but we have to work in this time for better ideas for the future. And those outsiders who are looking into the world of Islam, if they want to help, they will help by not making Muslims more insecure, but making them a little bit more secure and respected and dignified.
Let me challenge you here, okay?
Yeah.
I hear you. Who am I? If this is the feeling, I accept and respect, for sure. And as I said, Bernard Lewis explored it for a while and many others. But today we have a situation we didn't have maybe for 500 years, since the middle or the end of the 15th century. And this is, for the first time after so much time, we have a serious Muslim component in the midst of the Western liberated liberal democracies. North America, I take number-wise, you have more Muslims than Jews. In Europe, you have numbers that since the end of the Byzantine Empire you did not have. What are the chances that from these clusters, which are huge in numbers, will emerge what I call here, for the sake of our conversation, Western world Islam? I understand Muslim world Islam. But
Yeah,
Western Islam might be a different one.
yeah.
What is the chance of it?
I think there's a pretty good chance for it. I already see it happening. I mean, I think I see a lot of Western Muslims living in Western societies, especially in North America, well integrated. They're happy with the Constitution and the freedoms of this country. They criticize foreign policy of this country very a lot, as I would myself do, or Western countries, but that's okay. That's what citizens do. So, I mean, there are, of course, some hardcore figures too. You can hear one imam speaking in a radicalish mosque saying, "Oh my God, we Muslims will conquer here."
The blind imam.
And that imam is picked up by people who want to say, "Oh, you see, these Muslims are so dangerous people out there." And then it becomes viral, and a lot of people think so. There are pockets of people like that. And I debate with those people, by the way, as much as I can. But also, I see a Muslim appreciation of democracy in the West. I mean, I had a conversation about this with Sheikh Yasser Qadhi, who's a very prominent American imam, much more conservative than me, on whether the Western liberalism can be a model for us in Muslim majority societies. It's online, people can see it. And I initiated that conversation by reminding a sermon of his, in which he said, he's one of the top 3 maybe imams in America. He said to his Muslim audience, we Muslims should be thankful to have a constitution like the American Constitution that protects our freedom. Like, we can say whatever we want. We can open the mosque, whatever we want. This is not the case in most countries in the world. We should thank Allah for this constitution. And I said, I love that. That's why I would love to bring this kind of constitutional liberal regime to Iran, Saudi Arabia. Then we had a little bit disagreement on that. But I think many people are appreciating these Western liberal values. And I think it is initiating, if you ask me, something like the Haskalah in Judaism, the Jewish Enlightenment back few. Then Jews were more living in close communities. Liberalism came with a new promise, so they kind of adjusted to it. I would worry that the Haskalah was cut short by European fascists, right? I mean, Nazis at worst. So I would worry that something like that can cut the Muslim experience of integrating in Western societies. One more thing to that question. By the way, there's already a very liberal Western European Islam already existing in Europe. That's not in Western Europe, but is it Eastern Europe? If you look at Bosnia and Herzegovina, where my wife is from, if you look at Albania, Kosovo, these are Muslim majority societies who are liberal democracies, and who don't have any of the extremism or that kind of problem we have.
So before you wrap, can I assume that the hidden agenda, or maybe the overt agenda behind your writing, is to create the paradigmatic framework for this kind of Islamic thinking?
Indeed, both within the West and both in the Muslim majority world. I believe Christianity really had a major change with the Enlightenment by accepting religious freedom. Begins with Locke and other thinkers. Catholic Church was late in catching up, but they did in the 20th century with the Second Vatican Declaration and the Human Dignity Declaration in the 60s.
The Nostra Aetate of 60s.
Nostra Aetate, yeah, that was remarkable.
Too. Yeah.
And Judaism also had to reinterpret itself, as I understand, with the whole Jewish Enlightenment. And I think in Islam, we are in that historical moment. I mean, I see this as big one, Abrahamic 3. Jews were there before us, then came Christians, we Muslims came later. And we all have similarities and differences, but we can imagine still a world we can all live in peace as equal human beings with other faiths, and no faiths, of course, too. But we have to reinterpret things in our religious tradition. In Islam, I can see how that can happen. I'm working on all the technical arguments on how that can happen. I work with the people who already work with these things. It's a long-term battle, but I think it should be given a chance. And one thing that would make things much more difficult is forces outside of Islam, especially in the West, thinking that the extremists in our world represent all of us. So this is a threat. Therefore, they should expel all Muslims and close all the mosques in the West and that kind of stuff. That will only empower the extremist illiberals among us, which say this is all a lie. We will never,
What you say is, if this extreme fundamentalist Christian supremacy ideologies will prevail, it will reintroduce the defensiveness of back home in the West, in which they should have been much more secured.
Yeah. People will say the Taliban is right. They've been telling us that the only safe place for Muslims is an Islamic emirate. You know?
So let's go back home. Let's go back to Istanbul, okay? From all
Sure.
the neighborhoods of Istanbul, which one you love the most?
Well, I love the Bosphorus, of course. I mean, walking next to the water in Arnavutköy, the Albanian.
I love Ortaköy.
Ortaköy, Bebek, Tarabya, or the European, or the old city, of course. I mean, going through that.
You missed it?
Actually, here, I mean, the Halic,
that's the
bridge. That's the Galata bridge over the two sides. Yeah, anything around. Anything that is the old city reminds is beautiful, and it's a bit crowded. Istanbul, of course, these days. I go in the summers now to visit family, but yeah, Istanbul. I mean, it's just a fascinating city, and going there and to find a Byzantine church at the corner that nobody actually noticed, and people pass through, or finding a synagogue, the Neve Shalom synagogue, which I had the chance to visit a few times. It shows you all those lives in Istanbul that existed and remnants are still there. It was a more pluralistic place, and at least honoring that legacy will make more people more open-minded today, I think, on both sides.
And this Turkish version of Islam, maybe the Islam of the big cities, because the rural country is a bit different, can be a model for a better dialogue between the three Abrahamic religions that is not being offered by Islam emerging from other places?
There was this Turkish model talk 2 decades ago, and it looked more shining back then. Today, it's in a very populist authoritarian mood, Turkey these days. But, it happens in Europe too. Look at Hungary, look at other populist, movements today. I still think with all its flaws, with all its endless internal fights and, narrow-minded populism, nationalism, Turkey still has something to show. Today, you mentioned Turkey as a political Islam case. I mean, the ruling party definitely has that sort of narrative, and sometimes it may be more narrative than in reality. It's more pragmatic in many cases. But I would say still today, Turkey is a secular state. There's no Sharia in the legal tradition. Turkey is still a country where you can choose to go to the greatest nightclubs or the greatest mosques. It's still your choice. It's still a country with a large secular population and pious ones too. Just the pious ones became more powerful in bureaucracy and this and that, or at least conservative. Maybe they're not that pious always, but I mean, Turkey is going through these battles within Israel too. The religious right ascendants and others are worried about the future. But I think Turkey still is a country that shows that a country with 150 years of some democratic experience and secular law. And I tell people, look, I mean, you can be like Turkey. You don't have to have a Sharia in the legal system to live as a good Muslim. You can still live as a community, as an individual, but you can live under a secular state. And I don't think that people have pessimistic scenarios about Turkey. People think that the current party president will drag Turkey so deep into Islam. I don't think like that. I mean, I have issues, I have problems, I have criticized it, but countries don't change that dramatically. There's still a history of modernization, secular law. There's still a segment of society. I don't see an Iran-like scenario in Turkey. It's more like a populist, scenario, which you also have in some Western democracies these days.
It's fantastic. You say secular doesn't change so much, and still when you say bye-bye or farewell in nowadays Turkish, it's Allah Smaradik, right?
Allah Smaradik, yeah, which is
God be with you.
Give it to the safe hands of God, which means
so thank God for Allah, Jesus, God, Lord. It was a very, very fascinating conversation, Mustafa Bey. It left me with a lot of food for thought. And I really hope that we shall have a next chapter, because maybe the next one you will write about somebody more contemporary.
Yes, I'm working on a new book on religious freedom conversations in Islam. There's a Quranic verse, no compulsion in religion, la ikraha bid-din. But what's the full interpretation of that? So there's actually an edited book on that issue, but I would love to talk about that, or anything. Yeah, this was a lovely conversation. Thanks for having me, and I would love to have another chat. And when you come to DC, let me know. Maybe we can have coffee or Turkish tea, Turkish coffee, which one do you prefer?
Yeah, without sugar. Thank you very much, Mustafa. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
God
Bye.
bless
My
you.
pleasure. Allah'a ısmarladık. Yeah.
Allah ısmarladık.
Jerusalem Talks is brought to you by the University of Notre Dame's Academic Center in Jerusalem and was made possible by the efforts of Avraham Burg, Daniel Schwacke, Gabriel Mitchell, David Turgeman, Ben Wallach, and Nathan Steinmeier. Learn more about us at jerusalem.nd.edu.